over this whole tour that I had and kind of a both personal and professional growth, there was one thing that stick around for me for the past 35 years or so, and that is the fact that robots are amazing. They're genuinely great. Especially in the last 5 years, we have seen them bigger, stronger, faster than ever. They can do repetitive tasks at the pace that is impressive and with a precision that is really, really something that goes beyond any boundaries that we can imagine. But there's one other thing. Human limbs are unbelievable. They're actually even better than robots. If you take a look at just our hand, it has 20-something degrees of freedom. It is so versatile, it's so flexible. It's essentially one of the probably best tools we have in the world. Just this morning, I had to fix my bike, and it's quite a laborsome work. I did it with my hands. But also, like Jorma mentioned, I have tried to take care of my daughter and to just button up her onesie. And that's a very fidgety thing. I did it with the same hands. It's really the adaptability of limbs that we have are allowing us to do so many things, and they are allowing us to interact with the world, but also to just explore this world to the level that is really remarkable and really something that creates us as individuals. So you can imagine that with all this functionality, we also have this other aspect that our limbs are allowing us to do, and that is to create ourselves. So it's a part of our identity, and it's a part of who we are. So you have just maybe heard that I am using my limbs to present myself as an aspiring rugby player, but also I use my hands to be a clumsy father. So losing a limb is more than just losing a function. It's not just about the ability. We're losing a part of ourselves and the way that we interpret the world around us. So trying to find a remedy for something like this is not just about the substitution of the function. What we are trying to do is we're trying to help individuals transition this very harsh and very impactful moment in their lives, and to help them reinvent or reintegrate themselves into society. So providing robotic solutions is just a part of the whole story. So if we take a look, these functional robots, they get integrated into humans as prosthetics, and we can and we do deliver them to users all around the world. But what these robots do is they provide us with a sense of functionality only to a degree. And this is made possible by the way of us interacting with these robots. And that is where a culprit to this entire story comes into play. So if we think of it, the prosthetics nowadays interact with the human body through an interface at the level of a muscle. So when we have a muscle, every time we contract it, there's a series of electrical potentials that will appear at the surface of the skin. We can place small sensors, electrodes, on top of the skin and pick up these signals. We can then use various ways. We can apply machine learning in order to interpret these signals, create control algorithms, and move the prosthetics. So essentially, we are trying to interpret the muscle activity to the best of our knowledge in order to restore the function. However, even the most sophisticated state-of-the-art prosthetics nowadays can only provide you with a limited functionality. We get a couple of grips, maybe a few joint movements, and that's about it. Now, why is that? Where is the problem? We have this sophisticated robots. We have very impressive technology that can allow us to interpret these signals. Well, the problem is in the signals. What we are doing is we are placing the electrode on a surface of a muscle, and we get the information on whether that muscle is active and by how much. And that's about it. But generating emotion is something that is way more complex than that. And so I would like to take off this engineering hat I've been wearing so far and put now this biomedical side and try to explain you why we have to take a look at this problem from a kind of a different angle. So if we try to create emotion, the idea, the origin of the intention, starts from the brain. We take that information, the signals that originate in the brain, and they get travel down to the spinal cord. This is where us engineers would call mixture happens. These signals get transformed and encoded in a way that the spinal cord structures, so those little cells, the neurons in the spinal cord, get activated, and they generate a set of activities that travel through our peripheral nerves down to our muscles. our muscles or the muscle fibers get activated, they contract, and this is where those signals start appearing that we have been recording from the surface of the signal. And with each contraction, we pull on the tendons and the joints create the movement that we wanted. Now, in this entire pathway that I have just explained, we only sample at the level of a muscle from the surface, one sensor, one muscle, and that's all the activity. But there's much more embedded in here. So essentially, what we need to try to do is to access this information at the high level. And if we think of it, well, why don't we go at the brain level? And there are many fantastic researchers also done here at Aalto that do that exactly. So I have just yesterday seen a great work by some of our colleagues that are able to interpret the brain intention and use it to interpret user intention. However, these technologies are still in the making, and having them in the clinics and bringing them down to our patients is going to take a while. And there are also some other challenges that need to be overcome before we can fully rely on these concepts. So the next step is, why not going at the spinal cord? Well, spinal cord has evolved in such a way so that it prohibits us from interacting with it. If you just think of it, it is this very kind of shielded part of circuitry within our body that every time you try to do something with is going to resist at any costs. So it's extremely difficult to do it, and it's used only in the most severe cases. Then peripheral nerves seem like an obvious concept. But the point is that the signal that they carry are very noise prone, and we still need to do surgical interventions in order to get to them. And then the benefit of it doesn't really outweigh what we currently have within the domain of state-of-the-art. So the muscle still remains as a kind of the viable option for the clinical translation that we have at the moment. So now I can get back to my engineering hat and try to think of what are the different ways that we could actually get more from this signal. And there is this theory that if I have enough observation of an event or a series of events, I could have a chance of trying to untangle all the contributors to that event that I'm observing. So if we think of a muscle as a series of muscle fibers that are connected to the motor neurons in our spinal cord through those peripheral nerves that I just mentioned, we could try to place a whole number of electrodes on a single muscle, where I'm talking about tens and hundreds of electrodes, and try to observe this muscle contraction now from many slightly shifted observation points. And what allows me then here to do is to decouple, deconvolve, using very straightforward algorithms, the contribution of individual motor neurons from the spinal cord. So all of a sudden, I have used the muscle as this gateway into the spinal cord information. And this then allows us to build much more on. We have much more insights into what happens within our body. And as engineers generating control algorithms on the other side, we can then use this information to build more transparent, better, more functional algorithms. And that's exactly what we've done. So we have gone our way from this single observation to a high density recording where we have placed these hundreds of electrodes on top of our muscles, and we have built up these algorithms that decouple the information and allow us to look into the individual spikings or those firings of motor neurons at the spinal cord. Using this information, this very kind of high content information, we learned more about how human body functions. So the first thing we did is we've just improved the algorithms that we had and created more functional and more articulated motions for our users. So what we were able to do is provide them with the systems that allow for them to be precise, allow for them to generate smooth and natural looking motions. So to kind of start recreating what they used to have with their limbs, but also to build a sense of ownership and character through it. Not only that, we've also been able to observe that then their whole body is going to create much more natural movements. They're not going to try to overcome and overcompensate the actions that they do. They actually start owning the prosthetic that they have, which means we are now transitioning from just restoring function to starting to restore, hopefully, their sense of ownership of the prosthesis and potentially the way that they observe and interact with the world. There was also another thing that came out from this entire research, And that is that in cases of those patients that have very problematic injuries that had to be solved by high-level amputations, we had very limited, and we still have very limited solutions for them. So the prosthetics that we are trying to fit onto someone who has lost an arm at the level of their shoulders are very limited, because as I've explained just now, we have been really relying on the muscles in the periphery to extract those signals. But what if you don't have joints and you don't have muscles? What do we do at that point? Well, one thing that we do have is usually some small leftovers of the nerves that used to lead into those limbs. And those nerves can be, in simple engineering terms, rewired into the muscles in the proximity of the amputation. When there is no arm, the chest and the back muscles have very limited function. So what we can do is we can use those leftover nerves from the arm following the amputation, and our clinical partners have been redirecting them into the chest and into the back muscles. So now patients can think of opening or closing the hand, and their pectoralis muscle or their deltoids will start twitching. Now, because all that I've tried to convince you here today is that we should be looking at the firings of the spinal cord and not really care about the muscle as much than just a gateway to this information. We can place our high-density grids of this newly innervated muscles and start observing the spinal firings of the missing limb at the spinal cord from these newly reinnervated muscles. And moreover, we can then use machine learning to start recognizing the emerging patterns from each motion that they generate, and essentially associate these firings and the motor neuron pools at the spinal cord with the actions and the activities that the user wanted to do, and map those into our prosthetic devices. Therefore, we have created now an option, an opportunity for even high-level amputees to actually have functional prosthetic devices. Now, I have spent most of my time talking about how to restore the control, but we should not forget that humans, we are very sensory-oriented beings. We are actually quite sloppy with our control. What we do is we constantly correct, and we use our sensory information to adjust every kind of neural output that we are generating. In fact, our clinical partners have shown that 80% of your nerve fibers are sensory fibers. So it means that the bandwidth of the sensory information is quite high. So in that case, what we should try to do is try to restore the sensory feedback as well, so that this is not just a baseball bat at the end of the stump for our patients, but it's rather something that really provides information two-way. However, this is a difficult thing, and I myself grew up as a kid who really liked playing video games. And whenever you have a gaming console, you have those controllers and you get very engaged with a game that you're playing. At one point, this revolutionary technology came into which had this haptic feedback. And essentially, these were the controllers that vibrate every time something happens dramatic in the game. And those of you who've been playing probably know this concept of getting very engaged and very excited for about half an hour. And at that point, it becomes a nuisance. It's actually bothering me because I know what I'm doing. Let me just play. I don't want to have this buzzing on top of it. So I switch it off and never turn it on again. The fact is that we as humans are really good at ignoring things. And my wife can tell you a lot about that. But the point is, if the information is not really something that I can integrate and benefit from, I do tend to just focus on what gets me further, gets me a step up. And in that case, what we need to understand is what is the best way to provide useful information and how to encode it. And this is a problem that is still open and something that we are pursuing. But essentially what we are trying to understand is what happens in our brain when the sensory information comes, but also what happens when a sensory substitution comes. When we try to provide a vibration, when we try to perform an electrical stimulation, what happens when we obstruct the blood flow and all of a sudden have this very genuine sense of numbness. These are all very important aspects of how our limbs perform, and this is something that we should try to recreate in our patients so that we can try to essentially stimulate things at the level that is useful for them, and they can integrate and potentially create this sense of self, like, once again with their prosthetics and grow with it. Now, at this point, we are trying to observe how that activity changes in the brain and try to elicit the same actions using artificial means. And so I hope that I've managed to get you now through this short talk on a pathway from cells to robots and back to cells by observing how our spinal cord works, what are the technologies we can develop, and how we can restore human function and human identity through prosthetics. Thank you very much.